Welcome to the Life Paradox, where reality is stranger than fiction. Nancy Miller prided herself on running a godly household. A widow for 7 years, she'd raised her daughter Ellie with unwavering discipline and clear expectations. Their modest suburban home might lack a man's presence, but it certainly didn't lack structure. Nancy had sacrificed everything to give Ellie a proper upbringing, working overtime at the insurance office, forgoing dating, and centering their lives around Faith Community Church. So when 17-year-old Ellie sat trembling at their kitchen table that April morning, pregnancy test positive on the laminated surface between them, Nancy felt more than disappointment. She felt betrayed. How could you? Nancy's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The quiet intensity carried more weight than any shout. After everything I've taught you, everything we believe. Ellie's eyes remained downcast, her honey-brown hair falling forward to shield her face. I'm sorry, Mom, but I'm keeping it. Keeping it? Nancy's hands gripped the edge of the table. You're throwing away your future for a mistake? College? The scholarship we've worked for since you were 14? It's not a mistake, Ellie whispered, one protective hand moving to her still flat stomach. And I can still have a future. Nancy closed her eyes, praying for guidance. When she opened them, her resolve had hardened. Not in this house. Not if you insist on this path. Every paradox begins with a question. If you love unraveling life's biggest mysteries, hit subscribe and join the Life Paradox, where every story bends reality. The ultimatum came swiftly. Terminate the pregnancy or leave. Nancy believed with absolute certainty she was doing the right thing. Tough love that would force her daughter to make the correct choice. But as Ellie packed a single duffel bag, tears streaming silently down her face, something unacknowledged fractured between them. Where will you go? Nancy asked, standing in the doorway of Ellie's bedroom, arms crossed. Maya's. Her parents said I can stay until... Ellie couldn't finish the sentence. Nancy nodded stiffly. Maya's family had always been too permissive in her opinion. When you come to your senses, the door is open. By evening, news had spread throughout their tight-knit community. Nancy's phone buzzed constantly. Some messages supporting her stand for values, others expressing shock at her cruelty. Pastor Wilson called personally to remind her about compassion, though he carefully avoided directly criticizing her decision. That night, Nancy sat alone in her immaculate living room, surrounded by framed photos of Ellie's achievements, debate team trophies, honor roll certificates, the mother-daughter mission trip to Guatemala. She picked up their favorite picture. Ellie at 12, gap-toothed and laughing in the summer sunshine. For the briefest moment, doubt crept in. Then Nancy remembered her own mother's words. Stand firm in righteousness, even when it hurts. This was simply a necessary correction. Ellie would understand someday when she had children of her own, properly, after college and marriage. Nancy placed the photo face down and went upstairs to bed, telling herself the empty bedroom across the hall didn't bother her at all. 6 months passed with surgical precision, each day sliced neatly into work, church, and solitary evenings. Nancy maintained her routine with military discipline, as if adhering to schedule could fill the Ellie-shaped hole in her life. She'd heard through church gossip that Ellie hadn't returned to finish her senior year at Westridge High, information Nancy received with a tight-lipped nod while inwardly flinching. She's working at Diane's diner now. Margaret from the prayer group mentioned casually after Wednesday service. Sadie saw her there. Said she's showing quite a bit. Margaret's tone suggested both sympathy and a hint of satisfaction at being proved right about where these situations lead. Nancy merely nodded again, unwilling to reveal how each fragment of information about Ellie felt like swallowing broken glass. She hadn't expected the silence between them to stretch so long. In her daydreams, Ellie had returned within weeks, contrite, and ready to make better choices. Across town, Ellie balanced 3 plates along her arm, mastering a skill she'd never imagined kneading. Her uniform stretched tight across her swollen belly as she served pancakes to the morning regulars at Diane's diner. "Need to sit a minute, honey?" Diane asked, noticing Ellie's grimace as she passed the counter. "I'm fine," Ellie insisted, though her swollen ankles screamed otherwise. Pride wouldn't let her complain, not when Diane had hired her without a high school diploma or experience, not when she needed every dollar of her minimum wage and meager tips. After her shift, Ellie trudged to the small apartment she now called home. The elderly man on the first floor, Thomas, had offered her the upstairs unit at half the going rate after overhearing her situation at the diner where he took his daily coffee. "I was raised by a single mother," he'd explained simply. She could have used a break. The apartment was barely 500 square feet, a kitchenette, bathroom, and a main room that served as bedroom, living room, and now nursery. Ellie had furnished it with thrift store finds and items from Maya's parents' basement. A second-hand crib stood in the corner, assembled by Thomas when Ellie's belly had grown too big for her to manage it herself. Every evening, Ellie completed online coursework for her GED, determined not to become the cautionary tale her mother had predicted. Sometimes, her hand would hover over her phone, thumb poised to call the number she still knew by heart. But what would she say? That she was exhausted? Scared? That sometimes she still cried for her mother while folding tiny onesies donated by the diner staff? Meanwhile, Nancy maintained her position that she'd done the right thing, even as church. Friends began to drift away. Sometimes love must be firm, she told herself each night. But occasionally, in unguarded moments before sleep claimed her, Nancy wondered if love should feel this hollow. On a crisp October morning, Ellie gripped the hospital bed railings and brought her daughter into the world with a primal cry that contained both agony and triumph. Maya held one hand, Thomas the other, this makeshift family witnessing her transformation into motherhood. "She's perfect," the nurse said, placing the squirming, red-faced bundle on Ellie's chest. "What's her name?" Ellie gazed down at her daughter, this tiny person who had simultaneously complicated and clarified everything. "Emma," she whispered. "Emma Grace." The name carried no family legacy, not her absent father's surname, nor anything to honor the eye. Grandmother who had closed her door when Ellie needed her most. This child would begin with a clean slate. Across town, unaware she had become a grandmother, Nancy sat through Sunday service feeling increasingly isolated. The pew around her remained conspicuously empty despite the crowded sanctuary. She'd noticed the gradual shift, how conversations stopped when she approached the coffee table after service, how mothers with teenage daughters seemed to steer them away. "They'll come around," Pastor Wilson assured her after noticing her sitting, alone again. "People just don't understand difficult parenting decisions." But his words rang hollow as Nancy overheard a snippet of conversation in the ladies' room. "Can you imagine throwing out your own daughter? Mine could commit murder and I'd still—" The speakers fell silent when they saw Nancy, their expressions a mixture of embarrassment and judgment. Nancy held her head high as she washed her hands methodically, refusing to let them see how deeply their words cut. That afternoon, a package arrived, a plain manila envelope with no return address. Inside was Ellie's GED certificate, dated the previous month. No note accompanied it. Nancy sat at her kitchen table, tracing her daughter's name printed in formal black ink. Something about the official document made Ellie's absence suddenly, painfully concrete. For the first time since their separation, Nancy wept openly, shoulders shaking with suppressed grief. Meanwhile, Ellie established a grueling routine. Breastfeeding every 2 hours, returning to work after just 4 weeks because she couldn't afford more time off, catching moments to study between Emma's naps. Sleep became a luxury she barely remembered. Yet, amid the exhaustion, bloomed unexpected joy. Emma's first smile, a reflex, the book said, but miraculous nonetheless, the weight of her daughter asleep on her chest. The solidarity of other waitresses covering her section when Emma ran a fever and Ellie couldn't find childcare. "You're doing amazing," Thomas told her, volunteering to watch Emma while Ellie attended her online community college orientation. "Most people twice your age couldn't handle what you're juggling." His words sustained her through late-night feedings and moments of crushing self-doubt. Ellie was building something from nothing, a life that looked nothing like she'd planned, but was undeniably hers. Some nights, scrolling through course catalogs for an associate's degree in medical office administration, she allowed herself to imagine a future where stability wasn't just a distant dream. She still carried the wound of her mother's rejection, but it had begun to scar over, becoming part of her rather than defining her entirely. 3 years transformed everything. Emma grew from helpless infant to a spirited toddler with wild curls and an infectious laugh. Ellie, now 21, had completed her associate's degree and secured a position at Lakeside Pediatrics, a proper job with benefits and regular hours. The tiny apartment remained their home, though Ellie had gradually replaced the mismatched hand-me-downs with modest but intentional purchases that made the space truly theirs. Nancy's life, meanwhile, had contracted. She still attended Faith Community Church, though she'd switched to the early service where fewer people knew her story. Work, home, church, the triangular boundaries of her existence rarely varied. Occasional updates about Ellie filtered through, community gossip, each one simultaneously treasured and painful. Neither woman had anticipated their paths crossing on an ordinary Tuesday at Wilson's grocery. Nancy, selecting a single chicken breast and pre-packaged salad for dinner, rounded the produce section and froze. There stood Ellie, helping Emma choose between 2 apples with the patient tone of a mother used to explaining everything to curious ears. "This one's sweeter," Ellie was saying, completely unaware of her mother's presence just feet away. "See how it's more red than green?" Emma's serious nod of understanding made Nancy's breath catch. Her granddaughter, this little person with Ellie's nose and chin, but entirely her own personality, existed in 3 dimensions suddenly, not just as an abstract concept. Nancy's shopping basket clattered to the floor. Mother and daughter locked eyes across pyramids of neatly stacked oranges. "Ellie," Nancy managed, her voice hardly more than a whisper. Ellie instinctively pulled Emma closer to her side. "Mom." The formal address stung more than outright hostility would have. Nancy bent to retrieve her scattered items, using the moment to compose herself. "How are you?" she finally asked, straightening. "We're fine." Ellie's polite tone could have been addressing a stranger. "Emma, can you hold the basket for me?" The little girl nodded, solemn brown eyes studying Nancy with innocent curiosity. "She's beautiful," Nancy said, the understatement of her life. Ellie nodded once. "Thank you. We need to finish shopping before her dance class." The dismissal was gentle but firm. Nancy watched them move toward the checkout, Emma chattering about ballet shoes and twirling, while Ellie responded with genuine interest to each comment. They moved as a unit, complete without her. Nancy abandoned her basket by customer service and drove home in tears. That night, Ellie tucked Emma into her toddler bed in the corner of their apartment that had been transformed with fairy lights and colorful wall decals. "Who was that lady?" Emma asked as Ellie smoothed her covers. Ellie hesitated. "Someone I used to know. She looked sad," Emma observed with the unfiltered perception of a 3-year-old. "Sometimes grown-ups have sad feelings," Ellie replied carefully. "Would you like 2 stories tonight, or just one?" Later, sitting at her small table with a cup of tea, Ellie allowed herself to acknowledge the complexity of emotions seeing her mother had triggered. Anger and hurt, certainly, but also a faint, unwelcome pang of longing for what might have been. The hospital corridors felt endless as Nancy was wheeled from the emergency room to the cardiac unit. Mild heart attack, the doctor had called it, a frightening contradiction in terms. Nothing about the crushing chest pain, The fear she might die alone in her empty house had felt mild. Recovery brought unwelcome time for reflection. Lying in the sterile hospital room, Nancy confronted the hollowness of her existence. No one had visited except Pastor Wilson and his wife, who brought flowers and awkward conversation. The get-well cards from co-workers sat in a pitiful cluster on her bedside table. "Have you contacted your daughter?" the pastor asked gently before leaving. Nancy shook her head. "She wouldn't come." "You don't know that," he said, his hand briefly touching hers. "Sometimes bridges seem more thoroughly burned than they actually are." His words lingered after he left. That night, Nancy reached a decision that had been forming since the grocery store encounter months earlier. When she returned home, she found a therapist, not from her church community, but a professional with no preconceived notions about her situation. Dr. Marshall asked difficult questions about Nancy's own upbringing with rigid parents, about her fears for Ellie, about why maintaining moral principles had seemed more important than maintaining a relationship with her only child. What if both could have coexisted? Dr. Marshall suggested in their third session. Disapproval of a choice doesn't necessitate rejection of the person. The concept felt revolutionary and indicting simultaneously. Weeks of therapy culminated in a letter, handwritten on proper stationery, not the hasty text messages Nancy had occasionally composed and deleted over the years. "Dear Ellie, I don't expect forgiveness. I'm writing because I owe you an apology that can't be contained in a greeting card or brief conversation. I was wrong. Not just about one decision, but about what it means to love someone. I confused control with care. I thought I was protecting you from consequences, when I should have been protecting our relationship above all else. You've built a beautiful life without me. I saw that clearly in the store that day. I'm proud of you, though I have no right to that pride. If you ever feel there might be room in your life for me to know you and Emma, even in the smallest way, I would be grateful. If not, please know that I wish you every happiness." With love and deepest regret, Mom Nancy mailed the letter and lived with the distinct possibility it might go unanswered. The act of writing it had been necessary regardless of outcome. Across town. Ellie read the letter during Emma's dance class, sitting in her car with trembling hands. She'd recognized the handwriting immediately and nearly thrown it away unopened. Something, curiosity or perhaps emotional forensics, had stopped her. The words were unexpected. No justifications, no religious platitudes, no subtle suggestions that Ellie had still been wrong but was forgiven anyway. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Ellie called Maya and Thomas separately, reading them portions of the letter. "People can change," Thomas said thoughtfully. "I've lived long enough to see it happen. Not always, but sometimes." "But can you trust it?" Maya countered. "After everything?" Ellie stared at the letter, considering both perspectives. "I don't know, but Emma asks about family sometimes. She notices other kids have grandparents." The decision crystallized slowly. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps a controlled experiment in possibility. Ellie composed a brief response suggesting a meeting, not at either of their homes, but at West Side Park on Saturday. She would bring Emma. Thomas would accompany them as moral support. Nancy arrived at the park 20 minutes early, second-guessing her clothing choice, her haircut, whether bringing coffee for herself and Ellie seemed presumptuous. She'd purposely brought nothing for Emma, no gifts that might seem like bribery, no sweets that might conflict with whatever parenting choices Ellie had made. She sat rigidly on the bench by the duck pond, watching families and wondering how they made it look so effortless. The hugs, the casual interactions, the clear belonging to one another that she had severed with one terrible ultimatum. Precisely at 10, Ellie appeared on the path, holding Emma's hand. An elderly gentleman walked slightly behind them, protective, watchful. Nancy's stomach clenched, with the realization that strangers had stepped into the role she had abandoned. Emma spotted the ducks first and tugged at her mother's hand. "Can I see them?" "In a minute, sweetie." Ellie approached the bench cautiously. "Mom, this is Emma. Emma, this is—" She hesitated, clearly uncertain about introductions. "I'm Nancy," she supplied quickly, kneeling to the child's eye level but maintaining distance. "I'm very happy to meet you." Emma regarded her with solemn curiosity. "Do you like ducks?" The simplicity of the question nearly undid Nancy. "I do, especially the ones with the green heads." "Those are mallards," Emma informed her seriously. "We learned about them in preschool." Nancy nodded, impressed. "You're very smart." "Thomas says I get that from my mom," Emma replied, pointing to the elderly man who had taken a seat on a nearby bench, close enough to intervene but far enough to give them privacy. The awkward introduction complete, they walked to the pond's edge, Emma chattering continuously about ducks, her dance class, and a book about sharks she'd gotten from the library. Nancy listened intently, memorizing details of her granddaughter's life, aware that this moment was a gift that might not be repeated. Ellie remained mostly silent, offering Emma gentle guidance but volunteering little about herself. The careful distance she maintained spoke volumes. When Emma ran slightly ahead to get a better look at a family of ducklings, Nancy seized the moment. "Thank you for this," she said quietly. "I know it wasn't an easy decision." Ellie nodded once. "It wasn't about easy. It was about right. Emma should be allowed to form her own opinions about family." The pointed statement hung between them, Ellie offering her daughter the choice Nancy had denied her. They watched Emma counting ducklings aloud, her voice carrying across the water. 7, 8, Mom, there are 8 babies." "That's a lot for their mother to take care of," Nancy observed carefully. "Mothers do what they need to for their children," Ellie replied, the words neutral but weighted. As their allotted hour drew to a close, Emma grew tired and leaned against her mother's leg. They walked back toward the parking lot, the conversation becoming stiffer as the end approached. "She has your eyes," Nancy said as they prepared to part ways. "And your curiosity. I remember how you always wanted to know the why of everything." Something in Ellie's expression softened slightly. "She's her own person. That's what I want for her. To be herself, not anyone else's expectation." The message couldn't have been clearer. Nancy nodded, fighting emotion. "I'm proud of you, Ellie," she said finally. "Not because of what I did or taught. Clearly, I failed, in important ways. I'm proud of who you've become despite me." Ellie's eyes widened briefly at the unexpected words. She didn't respond directly, but said, "Emma has a dance recital next month. If you'd like to come, I can send you the details." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even close to the relationship they once had. But it was something. A tiny door left slightly ajar. Nancy watched them leave with Thomas, Emma turning once to wave. Only when they were out of sight did she allow herself to cry. Not from sadness this time, but from the sharp, painful hope that felt almost like healing. 5 years transformed their tentative reconnection into something none of them could have predicted. The weekly park meetings gradually expanded, first to dance recitals and school events, then to occasional Sunday dinners at Ellie's new apartment. Emma, now 9, accepted the evolution with childish flexibility, growing to love the grandmother who appeared in her life, like in a story, as she put it. Nancy had changed profoundly. The heart attack and subsequent soul-searching had softened her rigid edges. She still attended Faith Community Church but now volunteered with their Young Parents Ministry, offering practical support rather than judgment to teenagers facing unplanned pregnancies. "I learned the hard way what not to do," she told the church board when proposing the program. Maybe my experience can prevent others from making my mistakes. Her home, once a monument to order and propriety, now featured Emma's artwork on the refrigerator and a dedicated drawer filled with art supplies and books for weekend visits. The spare bedroom, once Ellie's, had been repainted purple at Emma's request, though Nancy had preserved the growth chart pencil marks on the inside of the closet door, a tangible record of Ellie's childhood that survived their years of separation. Ellie, nearly 27 now, had completed her bachelor's degree in social work. The journey had taken longer than the traditional path, with evening classes and weekend study sessions stretching over years, but the achievement felt sweeter for the struggle. Thomas had attended her graduation, proudly sitting beside Nancy, these two unlikely allies united in their pride. "I never could have done this without you," Ellie told Thomas privately after the ceremony, squeezing his weathered hand. "Nonsense," he replied, eyes misty behind his glasses. "You would have found a way. You always do." Their relationship had evolved beyond landlord and tenant into genuine family. When Thomas suffered a mild stroke the previous winter, it was Ellie who recognized the symptoms and called the ambulance, then moved him temporarily into their spare room during recovery. Today marked another milestone. The converted Victorian house on Maple Street gleamed with fresh paint as the small crowd gathered for the ribbon cutting. The sign above the door read, "New Beginnings Family Resource Center." Ellie's vision brought to life through grants, community support, and thousands of hours of planning. This center will provide childcare, counseling, educational resources, and community for young parents, Ellie explained to the local newspaper reporter covering the opening. "We want to be the support system I wish I'd had at 17. Ellie didn't mention was that Nancy had quietly contributed her retirement savings to help purchase the building, or that she would be volunteering 20 hours weekly to help with administrative tasks. Their collaboration remained private, not from shame, but from the mutual understanding that their story was just one among many that had shaped the center's creation. Emma, wearing a dress she'd selected specifically for the occasion, stood between her mother and grandmother as Ellie cut the ribbon. The crowd applauded, unaware of the profound journey represented by these three generations standing together, the broken relationship now mended with scars that had become part of its strength. Later, after the guests had departed and they were cleaning up scattered programs and paper plates, Nancy found herself alone with Ellie in what would become the center's kitchen. "I never imagined this," Nancy admitted, gesturing vaguely to encompass not just the building, but everything their reconciliation had become. Ellie nodded, understanding the unspoken complexity. "Me neither. But Emma did. Remember what she said? When she was 5? That sad people should help each other not be sad anymore." Nancy smiled, recalling her granddaughter's simple wisdom. Out of the mouths of babes. They worked in comfortable silence for a moment before Ellie spoke again. "We're not perfect, you know. It's still complicated sometimes." "Life is," Nancy agreed. "But we're trying. That counts for something." Outside, Emma's laughter filtered through the open window as she helped Thomas plant flowers in the center's garden. The sound bridged past and present, a reminder that healing rarely follows straight lines, and that second chances, while never erasing what came before, sometimes create something entirely new from the broken pieces.